He threw her trunk off the wagon before it even stopped moving. The latch split on impact. Nora Whitmore's belongings scattered across the frozen mud of Harding Creek's Main Street. A hairbrush, 2 folded dresses, a yellowed photograph, and the small tin recipe box that had survived everything life had taken from her. The box bounced once and landed face down in the dirt. Caleb Voss did not look back. He simply flicked the reins, and his black wagon rolled forward like she was already forgotten. The people on the boardwalk watched. Nobody moved. A woman near the feed store turned her face away. A ranch hand across the street pushed his hat down and found somewhere else to be. Nora stood in the road, 34 years old, widowed, one carpet bag still in her hand, staring at the back of the most powerful man in Montana as he drove away from her without a single word of explanation. She had traveled 11 days to get here. She bent down and picked up the tin box first. If you have ever stood in a place so foreign, it felt like the earth itself was rejecting you. If you have ever had to choose, in front of strangers, between falling apart and standing up, then you already know what Nora Whitmore felt in that moment. The question is not whether you would survive it. The question is what kind of person you would become on the other side. That answer changed everything. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story to the end, because the next few hours are going to show you something that money, pride, and stubbornness cannot prepare any man for. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach had arrived 20 minutes earlier than anyone expected, which meant Nora had been standing outside the Harding Creek relay station long enough to hear things people said when they thought she wasn't listening. "Third one this year," the station clerk muttered to his assistant, nodding in Nora's direction without any attempt at subtlety. "Marriage Bureau keeps sending them up from Kansas, and they keep coming back on the return coach inside a week." "What's wrong with him?" the assistant asked. "Nothing wrong with his money," the clerk said. "Everything wrong with the rest of it." Nora kept her eyes on the street and her expression neutral. She had learned that particular skill during the 2 years she spent nursing her first husband through the illness that finally took him, sitting at his bedside night after night while well-meaning neighbors said things in the hallway they thought she couldn't hear. She knew how to listen without appearing to. She knew how to absorb information that other people assumed she was too fragile to handle. The clerk was not entirely wrong. The Marriage Bureau's representative in Kansas, a careful, soft-spoken woman named Mrs. Aldridge, had taken Nora aside before she boarded the stagecoach and said, with the deliberate gentleness of someone delivering difficult news, that Caleb Voss was a complicated arrangement. "He is not a cruel man," Mrs. Aldridge had said carefully. "Not in the way some of the others are. He does not drink. He does not have debts. His ranch is the most profitable operation in 3 counties, and he has never once failed to provide for anyone under his roof." "But," Nora had said, because there was clearly a but. Mrs. Aldridge had pressed her lips together. "He buried his wife 4 years ago. Fever took her in August, very sudden, very—" She paused. "He didn't grieve the way most men do. He just closed, like a door that someone nailed shut from the inside. The 2 women we placed with him before you, both capable, both patient, they left within 5 days. One of them cried the entire return journey. She wouldn't tell us specifics, but she said the house felt like a place that had decided not to be lived in anymore." Nora had thought about that description the entire 11 days of travel. A place that had decided not to be lived in anymore. She understood what that felt like. Her own house in Abilene had started feeling that way in the months after Daniel died. The rooms too quiet, the objects too stationary, everything exactly where he had left it, because moving anything felt like an erasure. She had caught herself apologizing to his coat once, hanging on the peg by the door, for leaving it there untouched for so long. She was not naive about what she was walking into. She was simply out of options that didn't require her to pretend she was something she wasn't. The wagon appeared at the far end of the main street at 20 past noon. She recognized it immediately from the description: black-painted wood, brass fittings on the lantern brackets, 2 dark bay horses that moved with the disciplined energy of animals very well cared for. Everything about it communicated money managed by someone who paid attention to details. The man holding the reins did not look the way she had imagined. She had constructed a picture in her mind during the journey, something angular and rigid, a man who looked the part of a wealthy widower who had gone cold. What she saw instead was someone who appeared simply tired, deeply structurally tired, the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from hard work, but from carrying something heavy for too long without ever putting it down. He was broad-shouldered, his coat well-made and practical, his hat pulled forward against the October wind. His jaw was set hard and his eyes found her immediately, with an assessment that lasted approximately 3 seconds before he looked away. He did not climb down from the wagon. "Nora Whitmore," he said. It wasn't a question. "That's right," she said. "Your trunk gets loaded in the back. I'm not waiting on it." He nodded toward the station where her trunk had been left by the stagecoach driver. "Anything you need immediately? Carry it yourself." "All right," she said. She went and got the carpet bag herself, returned to the wagon, and waited while the station hand and Caleb's ranch hand, a young man named Pete, who had been sitting silently in the wagon bed, lifted her trunk and set it in the back. The whole process took 4 minutes. Caleb did not speak during any of it. When it was done, he looked at her again. "Life at the Voss Ranch is not a social arrangement," he said, in the tone of someone delivering terms rather than having a conversation. "I have a son, 9 years old. I have 18 workers. I have 3,000 head of cattle and 800 acres. I don't require a companion. I require someone who can manage a household competently and treat my son decently. If that suits you, get in. If it doesn't, I'll pay your fare back to Kansas right now, and we can both save ourselves a great deal of inconvenience." Nora looked at him for a moment. She thought about asking why the last 2 women had left. She thought about telling him that this speech, however practically delivered, was one of the stranger welcomes she had ever received in her life. She thought about pointing out that the word decently, applied to the treatment of a 9-year-old child, carried the weight of something that had not been happening. She said none of that. She picked up her carpet bag and climbed into the wagon. Caleb looked at her for just a moment longer than necessary before he turned forward and released the brake. They rode for 40 minutes without conversation. The land was extraordinary. She could see that even through the cold, the grassland stretching out in every direction, the mountains blue and enormous on the western horizon, the cottonwoods along the creek bottoms turning the pale gold of late autumn. Montana in October had a quality she hadn't anticipated, a kind of stripped-down grandeur that Kansas, with its flat abundance, didn't quite prepare you for. She watched the land and thought about nothing in particular. Caleb did not look at her once during the entire drive. It was Pete who finally spoke, quietly, from behind her in the wagon bed. "You need anything, ma'am? I got a spare blanket if you're cold." "I'm fine," she said. "Thank you, Pete." She heard Caleb's hands tighten slightly on the reins. She did not know why. The ranch appeared on a long, low rise, and even in October, even with the trees bare and the sky going gray with incoming weather, it was impressive in a way that went beyond simple wealth. The main house was large without being ostentatious. 2 stories, solid construction, a wide porch that ran the full front of the house. The barn was enormous. The paddocks were well fenced and well maintained. A bunkhouse sat back and to the left, smoke coming from its chimney in a way the main house was not. She noticed that immediately. The main house chimney was cold. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the temperature dropping, and no fire had been lit in the main house yet. This was when Caleb stopped the wagon and the trunk went wrong. She never fully understood what happened, whether Pete lost his grip or whether the latch was already damaged from the stagecoach journey, or whether Caleb simply moved the wagon forward too abruptly when he clicked the horses. What she understood was the sound of the latch giving way and the trunk sliding out of the wagon bed and hitting the ground. And she understood that Caleb did not stop. He pulled the wagon toward the barn at the same pace he had maintained throughout the drive, leaving her trunk split open in the dirt of the yard, her belongings scattered across the cold ground, and Nora standing beside it alone. Pete scrambled down from the wagon immediately and came back toward her, his face red with something that was either cold or embarrassment. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Let me help you. I'm sorry about the—" "It's all right, Pete," she said. "Thank you." She bent and began collecting her things methodically. The photograph of Daniel, the 2 dresses, the hairbrush, the recipe tin, which had landed face down and acquired a new dent in one corner but was otherwise intact. She gathered everything with the same deliberate calm she had used standing in the road on Main Street, because falling apart in the yard of a stranger's ranch on the first afternoon was not something she was willing to do. A woman appeared on the porch. She was perhaps 60, solidly built, with the expression of someone who had spent years managing other people's chaos and had developed opinions about it. She came down the porch steps and crossed the yard without hurrying. "Clara Whitlock," the woman said. "I keep this house." "Nora Whitmore," Nora said, still crouching in the dirt next to her broken trunk. Clara looked at the trunk. She looked at Nora. She looked toward the barn where Caleb had disappeared without any visible emotion crossing her face. "First one cried," Clara said. "Second one swore. What are you going to do?" Nora thought about it genuinely for a moment. "I thought I'd start with getting my things inside," she said, "if that's acceptable." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she bent down and picked up one of the dresses. "Kitchen fire's been out since morning," she said. "I'll show you where the wood is." The kitchen was the first real information she received about the Voss household. Not from anything Clara said. Clara was not a woman who explained things when silence would serve. But from the kitchen itself, from the evidence accumulated in it, the way mud accumulates in a doorway. The room was large and well-equipped, with a cast-iron range that must have cost more than most families spent on furniture, a long work table of thick-cut pine, shelves lined with more dry goods than Nora had kept in her pantry for 6 months in Abilene. There were good pots. There were sharp knives. There was, in the far corner, a small rocking chair with a worn cushion that clearly didn't belong in a kitchen, small enough to be a child's. Everything was clean, everything was organized, and nothing had been used in a long time. You can tell the difference between a kitchen that feeds people and a kitchen that stores supplies. The range had that specific quality of cold metal that meant it had not held a fire in days. The bread bowl on the shelf was bone dry. The butter mold had been washed and put away. "When did you last cook a proper meal in here?" Nora asked. Clara was laying the fire in the range. She didn't look up. "Cook does breakfast and noon meal for the hands at the bunkhouse. Mr. Voss eats there most days." "And the boy?" A pause. "Elliot takes his meals in his room." Nora looked at the small rocking chair in the corner. "Whose chair is that?" Clara finally looked up. Her expression was not hostile exactly. It was the expression of someone who had decided to let events speak for themselves. "It was Mrs. Voss's chair. She used to sit with Elliot in here while she cooked. He'd fall asleep in it sometimes. Mr. Voss won't have it moved." Nora looked at the chair for a long moment. "All right," she said. "Can you show me the pantry?" She met Elliot Voss at 4 o'clock, which was earlier than she had expected. She had been in the kitchen for 2 hours, quietly cataloging what was there and what was missing, making decisions about nothing yet, just learning the geography of the place. The fire was going in the range and the room had begun to warm, and she was going through a box of dried beans on the bottom shelf of the pantry when she heard a sound from the doorway and turned to find a boy watching her. He was small for 9, not unhealthily so. He had good color and his eyes were sharp and alert. But there was a careful quality to how he stood in the doorway, his weight balanced slightly toward the hallway behind him, like someone who had learned to position himself near an exit. "You're the new one," he said. "I am," she said. "I'm Nora." He looked at the fire in the range. Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite name. "The kitchen's warm," he said. "It is," she said. "Were you hungry? I haven't started anything yet, but I can find you something if you need it now." He shook his head. Then he looked at the rocking chair in the corner for a moment, and she watched him make a decision not to go to it. Instead, he leaned against the doorframe and kept watching her, assessing in the patient, thorough way of children who have learned that adults frequently say one thing and mean another. "What are you making?" he asked. "I haven't decided yet," she said honestly. "I'm trying to figure out what's here first. Do you have a preference?" He looked uncertain, not about the food, but about whether he was allowed to have a preference. "Mrs. Landers used to make biscuits," he said carefully. "Before." She didn't ask who Mrs. Landers was. "Do you like biscuits?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then I'll make biscuits," she said. "Go wash your hands if you want to help." He stared at her. "I'm serious," she said. "I could use someone who knows where things are in this kitchen. Clara showed me the broad outlines, but I expect you know the details better." He was gone from the doorway for about 90 seconds. When he came back, his hands were damp and his hair had been hastily smoothed down. "The flour's on the second shelf from the bottom," he said, "left side. And the lard is in the cold pantry, not the dry one. Pa had it moved in summer, and it never got moved back." "Good to know," she said. "Come in and shut the door. You're letting the warm air out." She did not see Caleb Voss again until supper. She had not expected to. Clara confirmed, without being asked, that Mr. Voss typically came to the main house after the evening check of the cattle, usually somewhere between 6 and 7 in the evening, ate whatever was left from the midday supply in the kitchen cold box, and then spent the evening in the study with his ledgers. This information was delivered without editorial comment, but Nora was beginning to understand that Clara communicated quite a bit through what she chose not to say. Nora spent the afternoon in the kitchen with Elliot. She made biscuits. He knew where the tin of baking powder was kept and retrieved it without being asked. She showed him how she checked the heat of the range without a thermometer, holding her hand near the oven door for a count of seconds. And he studied the technique with the focused attention of a boy who had not been taught anything in a long time and was hungry for it. She let him cut the biscuits from the rolled dough with the round cutter, and he did it carefully, seriously, repositioning each cut to waste as little dough as possible. "You've done this before," she said. "My mother showed me," he said. "She said cooking was important for everybody, not just for women." "She was right," Nora said. He looked at her sideways quickly, and then back at the dough. She put the biscuits in the oven and started a pot of beans with the smoked ham hock she'd found hanging in the cold pantry. And while they waited for the biscuits, she asked Elliot questions about the ranch. Not about his father, not about his mother, just about the place itself. What was the name of the brown horse in the near paddock? Whether the creek flooded in spring? What the mountains were called? He answered everything with increasing willingness, and she noticed that the careful positioning near exits gradually dropped away as the kitchen got warmer and the smell of biscuits began to fill the room. She had just taken the biscuits from the oven when she heard boots on the porch. The kitchen door opened. Caleb Voss stood in the doorway, and for the first time she saw him without the coat and hat, just a man of perhaps 40, lean and weathered, with the build of someone who had done real physical labor for years before graduating to managing others who did. He looked at Elliot first, then at her, then at the biscuits on the table. Something happened in his face that he controlled almost immediately. "I thought Clara said the cook doesn't work evenings," he said, addressing the general room rather than either of them specifically. "Clara said you ate from the cold box," Nora said. "That doesn't strike me as a supper for anyone." Silence. "I didn't ask for supper," he said. "No," she agreed. "But Elliot helped make biscuits, and there are more than 2 people can eat, so you're welcome to sit down." Elliot was looking at his father with an expression of careful neutrality that was absolutely heartbreaking in a 9-year-old. It was the expression of a child who had learned that hoping for something often preceded not getting it. Caleb looked at his son. He looked at the biscuits. "I have work," he said. "The work will be there in 20 minutes, Nora said. She said it evenly, without challenge, the same tone she'd used telling him she was fine in the wagon. Not pushing, just stating. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down. Elliot reached for a biscuit immediately, like he was afraid the moment might be revoked if he waited. Nora set the pot of beans in the center of the table and found 3 bowls and 3 spoons, without asking anyone where they were, because she had spent the afternoon learning the kitchen. Nobody said anything for a while. Caleb ate steadily and without apparent enjoyment, in the manner of a man who eats because it is necessary, rather than because it gives him pleasure. "The latch on your wagon needs replacing," Nora said eventually. His spoon paused. "I'm aware," he said. "Pete helped me get my things inside," she said. "He seemed concerned about the trunk. You might let him know it wasn't his fault." Caleb looked at her then. It was a different look than the 3-second assessment in town. Longer, harder to read. "Are you telling me how to run my ranch?" "I'm telling you Pete felt bad about something that wasn't his fault," she said. "What you do with that is your business." Another silence. Elliot was watching this exchange with the riveted attention of someone witnessing something they had never seen before. Caleb picked up his spoon again. "The latch was already cracked," he said, after a moment. Not an apology. She didn't expect one, but something adjacent to it, an acknowledgement. "I figured," she said. They finished the meal without any further conversation. When Caleb rose to leave, he picked up his bowl and carried it to the basin. She hadn't expected that. She watched him, and he caught her watching him and said, "I carried my own dishes before Margaret died, and I'm not planning to stop." Margaret. His wife's name. The first time he had said anything personal. "That's fine," she said. He left. Elliot sat at the table for a moment longer, looking at the place where his father had been sitting. "He never stays to eat," Elliot said in a tone of quiet wonder. "He always takes something to the study." "People can surprise you," Nora said. She began clearing the table, and after a moment, Elliot got up and carried his own bowl to the basin. Clara found her in the kitchen at 8 in the evening, after Elliot had gone to bed and the house had settled into its particular quality of silence. "You lasted the first day," Clara said from the doorway. "I did," Nora said. She was sitting at the work table with the recipe tin open, going through cards in the lamplight. Some of them were her own handwriting. Some were in Daniel's mother's hand. One was a scrawled note from a woman she'd met on the train to Abilene 7 years ago, who had pressed it into her hand at the station and said the apple cake recipe would serve her well someday. Clara came into the kitchen and sat down across from her, which Nora understood was significant. "The first woman he arranged for left on the second morning," Clara said. She said it felt hostile." "It doesn't feel hostile to me," Nora said. "No?" "It feels sad," Nora said. "That's different." Clara was quiet for a moment. "He was a different man before Margaret died. Not soft. He was never soft. But present. He paid attention to things. When Elliot was small, he used to carry that boy everywhere, on his shoulders, everywhere he went on the ranch. Showed him everything. Now he walks past him like—" She stopped. "Like it hurts," Nora said. "Yes," Clara said. "Like it hurts." Nora looked at the recipe cards under her hands. "How old was Elliot when she died?" 5. "He barely remembers her face now, I think. He remembers the kitchen because she was always in here and the smell of bread. He remembers that." Clara looked at the cold rocking chair in the corner. "He came in here every day for 6 months after she was gone and sat in that chair and didn't say a word. Just sat in it. Mr. Voss found him in here one night, asleep in the chair, and he stood in the doorway for a long time, and then he went away without waking him." Nora thought about that for a moment. "Clara," she said, "what do you want to happen here?" Clara looked surprised by the question. Not offended. Surprised. "I want that boy to have a childhood," she said finally. "That's all. Whatever else happens, I want that boy to stop eating alone in his room." Nora closed the recipe tin. "That I can work with," she said. She did not sleep well the first night. The room they had given her was on the second floor, at the end of the hall, and it was a perfectly adequate room. Bed, dresser, window that looked out over the east paddock. But the house made sounds at night that she wasn't accustomed to. The settle and creak of an unfamiliar structure. Wind finding gaps in the eaves that she'd learned to stop noticing eventually. Sometime after midnight, she heard Caleb moving through the house below her. Not restlessly, not pacing, just moving from one room to another with the slow, deliberate quality of someone who has been awake a long time and stopped fighting it. She heard the study door open and close. She heard faintly the sound of a chair being dragged across the floor. She lay in the dark and thought about the way Elliot had looked when Caleb sat down at the table, like a child recalibrating the rules of the world. She had seen that expression before, once, on the face of a neighbor's boy in Abilene, whose father had come home from 2 months of cattle driving. The boy had forgotten, slightly, that his father existed as a daily reality rather than an occasional visitor. And when the man walked in the door, there was this moment of reorientation. A child's whole nervous system adjusting to the presence of a parent who had been more absent than person. The difference was that the neighbor's boy's father had come home with his arms out. She was not sure what Caleb Voss's arms had forgotten how to do, but she had seen him carry his bowl to the basin. She had seen him sit down. She closed her eyes and listened to the sounds of the house settling, and made no plans and no promises. And eventually the sound of wind in the eaves became familiar enough that she slept. The morning came gray and cold, with the particular quality of October light in Montana that seemed to arrive already tired. She was in the kitchen before 5, fire going, when Caleb came through on his way to the barn. He stopped in the doorway when he saw the light under the door and opened it and found her standing at the range with coffee already made. He looked at the coffee. "I don't expect you to be up at this hour," he said. "I'm always up at this hour," she said. "Do you take it plain?" A pause. "Yes?" She poured a cup and set it on the table without ceremony. He picked it up and stood drinking it by the door, not sitting, still half in the posture of a man on his way somewhere else. But he was there, in the kitchen, in the warmth, drinking coffee that someone had made because they had known he would be passing through. "I want to start cooking meals in this kitchen," she said. "Regular meals at regular times at this table. Not the bunkhouse, not the cold box. Here." He looked at her over the rim of the cup. "The hands eat in the bunkhouse," he said. "I'm not talking about the hands," she said. "I'm talking about you and Elliot." Something shifted in his face. Not resistance, exactly. Something more complicated than resistance. The expression of a man who has been protecting a wound for so long, he's forgotten what it would feel like without the protection. "I don't have time to—" "I'm not asking you to change your schedule," she said. "I'm asking you to sit at your own table with your son for 20 minutes in the evening. That's all." The wind outside hit the side of the house with a sound like a flat hand on wood. Caleb set his cup on the table. "I'll consider it," he said, and went out to the barn. She looked at the cup on the table. It wasn't a yes. It was the first word she had ever heard him say that wasn't definitively a no. She picked up the cup and washed it, and then she began making plans for supper. The consideration lasted exactly one day. Caleb did not appear for supper on the second evening. Nora had made a proper meal. Roasted chicken with root vegetables, bread she'd started that morning, a pot of strong coffee. She had set 3 places at the table without making any announcement about it, and Elliot had come down from his room at the smell and sat in the chair he'd used the night before, watching the door with the careful patience of a child who has learned not to expect too much. 6 o'clock came. 6:30. At 6:45, Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway and said, without inflection, "He's still in the north pasture. One of the fences came down this afternoon. Could be another hour." Elliot's face went through something in about 2 seconds, a quick collapse that he reassembled almost immediately into the neutral expression he'd been wearing when Nora first met him. The speed of it was what got her. He'd had practice. "Then we'll eat," Nora said, "and I'll keep a plate warm on the back of the stove." She served Elliot and herself, and they ate together at the table, and she asked him about the horses. He'd mentioned the brown one in the near paddock, and she hadn't yet gotten the full story. And he told her the horse's name was Copper, and that Copper had a habit of unlatching his own paddock gate and letting himself out if you didn't use the secondary bolt, and that last spring he had gotten into the vegetable garden and eaten most of the young bean plants before anyone noticed. "Your father's vegetable garden?" she asked. "My mother's," Elliot said. "It's not really a garden anymore. Nobody plants it." She kept her voice level. "Where is it?" "South side of the house. There's still the fence posts." She filed that away. They were washing the dishes. Elliot had begun doing this without being asked, which told her that somewhere in his history someone had taught him, and the lesson had stuck. When the back door opened and Caleb came in, he was cold from the outside, the fence work evident in the mud on his coat, and the particular set of a man who has been working in the dark and the wind for 3 hours on something that should have been a 1-hour job. He saw the clean table and stopped. "There's a plate on the stove," Nora said, without turning from the basin. He didn't say anything. She heard him pull off his coat and hang it on the peg. She heard that specifically because it was the peg next to the peg she'd used, and she heard the small sound of the coats touching. Then the sound of him pulling out the chair at the head of the table, and the quiet of a man eating alone after a long and difficult evening. Elliot dried the last bowl and set it on the shelf, and said goodnight in a voice that was aimed at the general room rather than his father specifically, the way you say things when you want them received but are not sure they will be. "Good night," Caleb said. Elliot glanced at Nora once, quickly, and then went upstairs. She finished at the basin and dried her hands and turned to find Caleb eating with his eyes on the table, not looking at anything in particular. He had the chicken she'd kept warm and the bread and the coffee, and he was eating it in that same functional way she'd noticed the night before, not tasting it so much as processing it. "It's good," he said, without looking up. It took her a moment to realize he meant the food. "Thank you," she said. "I'm not good at—" He stopped, and she waited, and he didn't finish the sentence. He picked up his coffee cup instead. "The fence will need 2 more hours in the morning. Pete should have caught it last week." "Will you tell him that?" she asked. He looked up then. "I run a ranch," he said. "Not a schoolhouse." "Pete's 22, she said. "You can tell him he missed something and it cost you 3 hours without making it a punishment." The silence that followed was not hostile. It was the silence of a man deciding whether to argue a point that he suspected he might not win. "You've known Pete for 2 days," he said finally. "I know what it looks like when someone's afraid to bring bad news to the person above them," she said. "You see it in the way he anticipates things. He's not careless. He's nervous." Caleb set down his coffee. He looked at the wall for a moment, at something that wasn't there. "I don't yell at my men." "No," she said. "You just go very quiet. Some people find that harder." He looked at her. She had perhaps pushed that one further than intended. She waited for him to close the door the way he usually did. The fractional hardening, the conversational withdrawal that she had already come to recognize as his primary defensive maneuver. Instead, he said, "Margaret used to say the same thing." The kitchen went still. He appeared to realize immediately that he'd said it, and something moved across his face that she could only describe as a flinch. Not physical, but interior, the way a man flinches from touching something he forgot was hot. "I'll look at the fence myself in the morning," he said, standing up. "Leave Pete on the south herd." He carried his plate to the basin just as he had the night before, and then he left the kitchen, and she stood alone in the warm room and understood that she had just been given something that he hadn't planned to give anyone. Well, the weather turned mean at the end of the first week. Not a blizzard, not yet, that was still a month away, according to Clara, who delivered this information with the serenity of someone describing the inevitable, but a sustained cold that dropped temperature fast enough to kill anything still alive in exposed ground and drove the wind off the mountains in the kind of gust that made the main house shake in a way that felt, at 2 in the morning, more personal than meteorological. Nora learned the cold differently than she'd learned Kansas cold. In Kansas, cold was horizontal. It came across the flat ground and hit you directly. Montana cold was multi-directional. It came from the mountains and from the sky and up from the frozen ground simultaneously, so you felt it from every angle at once, and the only real remedy was a fire and another human body, and preferably both. She doubled the kitchen fire and began cooking things that held heat. Soups and stews and slow-cooked things, the kind of food that kept a body warm from the inside. She found wild rice in the pantry that had been there long enough to develop opinions about storage conditions, but it was still good, and she made it into a soup with dried mushrooms and the remains of a ham that Clara had been uncertain about. She baked twice a week because bread was heat and bread was comfort, and bread was the one food that almost nobody, regardless of circumstance, could walk past without slowing down. Elliot began appearing in the kitchen every afternoon without being invited, which she interpreted as a good sign. He had a project he didn't want to talk about directly. She could tell because every few days he'd ask her a question that was clearly adjacent to it without disclosing the center. He asked her how you waterproofed leather. He asked her whether pine pitch was useful for anything practical or just for starting fires. He asked her what the difference was between a hinge and a pivot point, and whether you could make a hinge work on something that wasn't flat. She answered each question honestly and without asking what it was for, and she watched him write the answers in a small notebook he kept in his coat pocket, which he did when he thought she wasn't looking. On the 8th day, she came around the corner of the barn and found him crouched in the lee of the structure out of the wind, working on a wooden box with his penknife and a piece of leather cut from what appeared to be an old harness strap. The box was small and well made. Someone with actual carpentry skills had built it. And he was fitting a leather hinge to the lid with the focused intensity of someone solving a problem that mattered. She stood there for a moment and then came forward. "What are you making?" she asked. He startled and then got control of himself and then seemed to decide something. "A box," he said. "For my mother's things. Pa keeps them in a burlap sack in the storage room because the box they were in got broken. It's been 3 years. She looked at the small, careful hinge in his hands. "That's a good hinge," she said. "I don't know if the leather will hold," he said, "if the weight of the lid is too much." "Cut 2 pieces and double them," she said. "Twice the thickness, twice the strength." He looked at her. Then he looked back at the hinge. Then he nodded and pulled out his knife again. She left him to it. It was Pete who told her about the ranch's underlying situation, not deliberately, but in the way that people disclose things when they are simply too tired not to. She found him one afternoon mending a section of fence near the kitchen garden. He'd taken to finding small repair jobs near the main house, which she suspected was less about the work and more about the warmth of a kitchen window, and someone who didn't make him feel like he was constantly about to be in trouble for something. and she brought him out a cup of coffee, and they stood on opposite sides of the fence post while he drank it. "Mr. Voss ever talk to you about the South Range?" he said eventually, which was Pete's way of entering a subject through the side door. "He doesn't talk to me about the ranch much," she said. "Yeah," Pete said. He wrapped both hands around the cup. "There's a man named Garrett Holt. He owns the land east of us, the Double H. He's been buying up range rights from the smaller outfits around here for about 2 years. Whenever someone has a rough season, Holt turns up with a very reasonable offer, and next thing you know, he's got another 400 acres. And Caleb's had a rough season," she said. Pete looked at her sideways. "I don't know what Mr. Voss has told you about the finances." "Nothing," she said. "But the north pasture fence has been unmaintained long enough that the post footings are rotted. That doesn't happen in one bad year." Pete drank his coffee. 3 bad years," he said after a moment. "Drought the year before last, early freeze last year, lost a good portion of the fall calves. Mr. Voss won't sell to Holt, won't even hear the name in conversation. But Holt keeps circling." He paused. "He's been talking to the bank in Harding Creek. That's all I know, and I only know it because my cousin works there and told me to keep my eyes open." She thought about this. "Does Caleb know Holt is talking to the bank?" "I don't know what Mr. Voss knows," Pete said carefully. "He doesn't share that kind of thing." She handed him back the empty cup. "Thank you, Pete." He looked at her with the expression of someone who has said more than intended and is not sure whether that was a mistake. "I probably shouldn't have. You told me things I needed to know about the place I live," she said. "That's not the same as gossip." He went back to the fence, and she went back inside, and she stood in the kitchen for a long time with her hands wrapped around her own cup, thinking about rotted fence posts and a bank in Harding Creek, and a man named Garrett Holt who turned up with reasonable offers when people were vulnerable. She had seen that pattern before, in Abilene. The form was different. It had been a grain merchant rather than a cattleman. But the architecture was the same. Wait for the bad season. Move when the ground is soft. She did not know what she could do with this information, but she put it away carefully in the same place she put everything else she was learning about this ranch. She met Garrett Holt on the 12th day. She had not been expecting him, which was probably the point. She was on the front porch shaking out a rug. One of those tasks that looks like housekeeping but is really an excuse to stand outside and look at the land for 10 minutes without anyone thinking you're doing nothing. When a wagon came up the main track from the south, moving at the easy pace of someone who considers himself expected. The man who climbed down was perhaps 50, well-dressed in the way that people are well-dressed when they want to communicate prosperity without appearing to try. He was not large, but he moved with the deliberate unhurriedness of a man who had spent years cultivating the impression that he owned whatever room he walked into. He looked at her on the porch and smiled with the part of his face that was not his eyes. "Mrs. Voss?" he said. "Nora Whitmore," she said. He absorbed this information without any change of expression. "Is Cal in? I have some business." "He's in the north pasture," she said. "I can tell him you called." "I'll wait," Holt said pleasantly, and moved toward the porch steps with the ease of a man who has been turning up at this house long enough to feel entitled to it. "He'll be a while," she said. "Fence work." "That's all right." He smiled again. "Ranch like this has a lot of fence to maintain. I've always thought Cal takes on more than one man can reasonably manage. Too much range for the operation he's running these days." He said it thoughtfully, conversationally, as if it were an observation made out of concern. "I'd be happy to wait inside if there's coffee on." She looked at him for a moment. "There's coffee," she said, "but the kitchen's busy right now. You're welcome to wait in the yard." The pleasantness thinned, just barely. "Of course," he said. She went back inside and left him in the yard. Clara was at the kitchen table doing mending, and she looked up when Nora came in. "Holt?" she said. "You saw him from the window." "I saw the wagon. He uses the same one every time." Clara set down her mending. "He'll wait 2 hours if he has to. He's patient." "What does he want when he comes?" "Same thing he always wants. He finds a new angle every time, but it's the same thing." Clara looked toward the window. "Mr. Voss runs him off eventually, but lately he's angrier about it after. Like each visit costs him something more than just the hour." Nora looked out the kitchen window at Holt in the yard, standing with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the barn with the expression of a man pricing things. She thought about what Pete had said about the bank. Caleb came back from the north pasture at 3:30 and found Holt in his yard, and the change in him was immediate and significant. Not explosive, nothing so readable as that, but a tightening of the entire physical structure, a compression, like a man gathering himself against something he'd rather not be dealing with. She watched from the kitchen window. The conversation in the yard lasted about 10 minutes. She couldn't hear the words, but she could read the shape of it well enough. Holt doing most of the talking, affable and unhurried, Caleb standing with his arms crossed and his weight back, responding in short intervals. At one point, Holt made a gesture toward the south range with an expansive arm movement, and Caleb turned his head and looked in that direction for a moment, and then looked back at Holt and said something that ended the conversation. Holt smiled, tipped his hat, and left in the same unhurried wagon. Caleb stood in the yard for a full 2 minutes after the wagon was gone, not moving, just looking at the track. Then he came inside. He didn't go to the kitchen. She heard him go to the study, and the sound of the door closing, not hard, but with the absolute finality of a door closed by a man who has decided he is done with the day. She left him alone. At supper, she made a simple meal, beans and cornbread, the kind of food that didn't require appreciation, that just sat on the table and did its job. Elliot came down and ate. Caleb did not appear. At 7:30, she put a covered plate on the stove, turned down the lamp, and went upstairs. She lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the house. At some point, she heard him come out of the study and go to the kitchen, and she heard the small sounds of a man finding his plate and sitting down alone, and she thought about what Pete had said about the bank, and what Clara had said about each visit costing him something more, and what Holt had looked like standing in the yard pricing the barn with his eyes. She thought about the recipe tin on the kitchen shelf. She thought about what it meant to arrive somewhere with almost nothing and have to figure out, from the evidence available, what kind of trouble you'd walked into and whether there was something you could actually do about it. She found the ranch's account book on the 14th day, which was an accident. She had been looking for a particular pot that Clara said was stored in the storage room off the kitchen, a deep copper one, good for preserving. And while she was moving boxes to find it, a ledger slipped from the shelf above and landed open on the floor. She picked it up intending to put it back, and the numbers were visible before she had time to decide not to look. She was not an educated woman in the formal sense, but she had managed a household through 2 years of Daniel's illness on a diminishing income, and she understood numbers well enough to know when they were going in the wrong direction. She stood in the storage room for perhaps 3 minutes and read what was in front of her. What she saw was not catastrophe, but it was close enough to catastrophe that the difference mattered only if something changed. She put the ledger back. She found the copper pot and brought it to the kitchen and began the preserving job she'd been planning. And while she worked, she thought about what it would mean to lose the ranch. Not abstractly, concretely. What it would mean for Elliot, who was already carrying more loss than a 9-year-old should have to manage. What it would mean for the 18 men who worked the land and lived in the bunkhouse and whose names she was still learning. What it would mean for Caleb, who had built something here over 20 years and was in danger of watching it swallowed by a patient man with good timing and a connection at the bank. She thought about what she could actually do with a copper pot and a recipe box and the specific skills she had accumulated over 34 years of managing things with insufficient resources. She thought about this kitchen garden with the fence posts and no plants. She thought about what Clara had said about the ranch hands eating separately, and about Caleb eating from the cold box, and about Elliot eating alone in his room, and how a house could be full of people who were each, individually, doing without. She filled the pot with water and set it on the range to heat. There was a practical thought beginning to form, and she needed to think it through carefully before she did anything with it, because it had implications that went beyond cooking. But the basic shape of it was this: a household that ate together was harder to defeat than a household that ate separately. Community was harder to dismantle than isolation. And she had. In this kitchen, and in this pantry, and in the labor she could provide and the things she knew how to do, the beginning of something. Not a solution. She wasn't naive enough to think she could fix a 3-year financial decline with soup and bread. But she could change what this house felt like. She could change whether the people in it felt like they were holding on alone or holding on together. That was something. It was not nothing. On the 16th day, Caleb came to the kitchen at 5 in the morning and found her already at the range. And instead of taking his coffee and leaving, he sat down at the table. She didn't remark on it. She poured his coffee and went back to what she was doing, and he sat there in the early darkness and drank it, and after about 10 minutes he said, "You talked to Pete." She turned from the range. "He told me some things." "About Holt." "And the bank," she said. Caleb's jaw tightened. "That's not Pete's business to share." "He didn't share it for gossip," she said. "He shared it because he's worried. Pete worries too much." "Or exactly the right amount," she said. He looked at her. She held the look. "The bank arrangement is not settled," he said after a moment. "Holt has no standing yet." "Yet," she said. He set his cup down. "I've been through difficult seasons before." "I know you have," she said. "And I'm not asking to be told things that aren't my business. I'm asking one question." She turned fully from the range and faced him. "Is there something I can be doing that I'm not?" He stared at her. It was a different kind of staring than the assessment in town or the confusion after Margaret's name had slipped out. This was the look of a man encountering a variable he hadn't accounted for. In all the planning and the worry and the management of a ranch under pressure, it apparently had not occurred to him that the woman he'd brought to manage his household might have something to offer that had no category in his existing framework. "Like what?" he said. "The ranch hands," she said. "They eat in the bunkhouse. They work your land and they've been doing it through bad seasons, which means they've made choices to stay when they could have found other work. They have families in some cases, or plans, and they've tied those things to this place. That's worth something. When people feel like they belong somewhere, they work differently. They make decisions differently." He was listening. He looked like a man who didn't entirely know he was listening, but he was. "I want to start doing a proper supper on Sunday evenings," she said. "For everyone. Hands and all. Here, or if the kitchen is too small, then in the barn with the tables brought in. A real meal, not bunkhouse food, and everyone at the table." He didn't say anything for a long moment. "That's a lot of work," he said. "That's what I do," she said. He looked at his coffee cup, at the window, at the door, in the manner of a man looking for the rational objection and finding it slower than expected. "And you think this helps with the bank," he said. "I think it helps with what you have to offer that Holt doesn't," she said. "Holt can make a number larger. He can't make anyone feel like they matter. Those are different currencies and only one of them lasts." Silence. The fire in the range popped once, settling. "Sunday," he said finally. "Sunday," she said. He picked up his cup, finished the coffee, and stood. At the door he stopped with his hand on the frame, not turning around. "The copper pot in the storage room," he said. "It needs the handle re-riveted before you use it for anything heavy. There are rivets in the left drawer of the workbench in the barn." She looked at the back of his head. "Thank you," she said. He went out into the morning, and she turned back to the range, and outside the kitchen window the sky over the mountains was beginning to go pale at the edges with the first gray light of another cold Montana day. And for the first time since she had arrived, the house didn't feel like a place that had decided not to be lived in. It felt like a place that was making up its mind. The Sunday supper took 3 days to prepare and nearly didn't happen at all. The first problem was the barn. Caleb had said nothing to the hands about it, which Nora discovered on Thursday when she asked Pete how many men she was cooking for, and Pete looked at her with the expression of someone who had not received a particular piece of information he apparently should have received. "Sunday supper," she said. "In the barn. Everyone together." Pete's mouth opened slightly. "Mr. Voss said that?" "He did." Pete looked toward the north pasture where Caleb was currently unreachable, then back at Nora, then at the barn behind her. "How many tables do you need?" "How many men are there total?" 18, he said, "plus you and Mr. Voss and Elliot. And Clara, I'd guess." "So 22, she said. "Can you get tables in there?" "We've got 4 long ones in storage from when Mrs. Voss used to do harvest dinners," he said. And then he stopped, and the information settled over both of them for a moment. The fact that these tables existed, that they had been used once, that they had been in storage long enough to accumulate a different kind of weight than just wood. "Good," she said. "Saturday morning, if you can. I'll need the space to set up by noon." The second problem was Clara, not opposition, exactly. Clara had moved past active resistance somewhere in the second week in the gradual and unannounced way that Clara did everything, without making it a moment. But she had opinions about the Sunday supper that she delivered while helping Nora inventory what the kitchen could realistically produce for 22 people. Harvest dinners were Margaret's thing, Clara said, not looking up from the shelf she was counting. She did them every year from the 1st September until she got sick. The men looked forward to them. Is that a problem? Nora asked. I don't know, Clara said, with the honest uncertainty of a woman who actually didn't know. Some of the hands were here when she was alive. They remember. You'll be standing in a space that has a shape in it already. Nora thought about that. I'm not trying to be Margaret. No, Clara said. But you'll be doing what Margaret did, in the place where Margaret did it, for the men who remember Margaret doing it. Whether you're trying to or not. She finally looked up. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying know what you're walking into. Nora knew. She had been walking into spaces with shapes in them already since she arrived. The kitchen with the rocking chair, the house with the cold chimney, the dining room table with 3 chairs instead of 2 that Caleb had apparently never removed. The entire ranch was a kind of archaeological site, each layer of the present sitting on top of something that had been there before. What did she make? Nora asked. For the harvest dinner. Clara was quiet for a moment. Roast beef when they had it, bean soup, cornbread, peach cobbler from the preserves. Do we have peaches put up? 6 jars from last summer, Clara said. I didn't know what else to do with them. We'll make cobbler, Nora said. Clara looked at her for a long moment and then turned back to the shelf and kept counting. The third problem was Caleb himself. He did not withdraw the agreement. He didn't do that, and she was beginning to understand that Caleb Voss did not uncommit from things he had committed to, which was both a strength and a source of considerable difficulty in his life. But he moved through the Thursday and Friday before the Sunday supper with the tight, compressed energy of a man preparing himself for something he was not certain he could manage. She saw it in small things. The way he came to breakfast on Friday and ate faster than usual and left before Elliot came down. The way he found reasons to be in the north pasture or the far barn at the hours when she was most visibly preparing, as though proximity to the preparations was a thing to be avoided. The way he came to the kitchen for his evening coffee on Friday night and stood at the back door instead of sitting at the table, drinking it, looking out at the yard. She didn't push. On Saturday morning, Pete and 2 of the other hands, a quiet man named Virgil, who was perhaps 50 and had been on the Voss ranch for 12 years, and a younger one named Daniel, who had the unfortunate luck of sharing a name with her dead husband but was otherwise entirely his own person, brought the harvest tables out of storage and set them up in the barn. Nora went to inspect and found herself standing in a space that told her things immediately. The tables were solid, well-made, built to last. They had been stored with care, stacked on sawhorses to keep them off the ground, covered with canvas that had itself been kept in decent condition. Someone had been maintaining that storage even while the dinners themselves stopped happening. She suspected it was Clara, and she didn't ask. Elliot appeared at her elbow while she was measuring the space in her head. Ma used to put pine boughs on the tables, he said. He said it in the same careful tone he used for all Margaret-adjacent information. Factual, slight distance. Not yet sure if the fact was safe to offer. Along the center, she said it smelled like winter. Do you know where she got them? The north tree line, he said. There's a stand of ponderosa up there. You can smell them from the fence when the wind comes down right. She looked at him. Could you get some? She said. Not a lot. Just enough for the tables. He stood up slightly straighter. I'd need the small hatchet. Ask Pete, she said. Tell him I said it was all right. He was gone at a run before she finished the sentence, which was the most unguarded she'd seen him move since she arrived. Saturday was the hardest day of cooking she'd done in years. She had planned it carefully, which was the only reason it was manageable rather than impossible. The things that needed to be started first, the things that could wait, the things that had to be done in a specific sequence, or the whole architecture collapsed. Clara worked beside her without needing instruction, anticipating the next need in the wordless way of someone who had spent decades in the domestic management of complicated households. They did not talk much. They didn't need to. By late afternoon, the barn smelled of pine from the boughs Elliot had brought back in a careful armful, his coat sticky with sap, his face lit with something that was trying very hard not to look like pride. He had arranged them himself along the center of the tables, unevenly, in the way of a child doing something real for the first time, and Nora looked at the arrangement and said it was good and meant it. Caleb came into the barn at 4 o'clock. He stood in the entrance for a moment, taking in the tables and the bows and the setup, and something happened in his face that he didn't entirely control this time. A softening, fast and involuntary, before the habitual discipline reasserted itself. Elliot was still adjusting one of the pine arrangements at the far end of the table. He hadn't noticed his father yet. Caleb watched his son for approximately 10 seconds. And in those 10 seconds, Nora watched Caleb watch Elliot, and what she saw in the man's face was not complicated. It was the simplest possible thing. It was a father who loved his child and did not know how to be near him without it hurting. Then Elliot looked up and saw Caleb, and the careful neutrality came back immediately. Not hostile, just braced. "Looks good," Caleb said. His voice came out rougher than he probably intended. Elliot looked at the pine boughs and back at his father. "Nora said to get them from the north tree line." "I know where the ponderosas are," Caleb said. He came further into the barn and looked at the full length of the table. "Your mother would have done the same thing." The barn was quiet enough that Nora could hear the wind outside finding the gap under the south wall. "I know," Elliot said, very quietly. Caleb put his hand on the table briefly and then took it away. "It looks good," he said again, and went back out. Elliot stood at the end of the table for a moment and then went back to adjusting the pine boughs. But his movements had changed, less purposeful, more something that needed doing with his hands while he worked out what had just happened. Nora went back to the kitchen and did not say anything about it to anyone. Sunday came in clear and very cold, which was a mercy because it meant the men came in from the afternoon's work ready for warmth and food rather than dragging wet coats and boots that smelled of mud and cattle in wet weather. By the time the light was going at 5 o'clock, the barn had the fire going in the corner stove that Pete had cleaned and stoked that morning, and the smell coming from the kitchen was the kind of smell that does something specific to people, something below the level of thought, older than decision-making, that has to do with safety and winter and enough. Nora carried food out in batches, and Clara carried food out, and Elliot carried food out with the seriousness of someone entrusted with something important. And even Pete carried a pot under Nora's instruction, looking slightly alarmed the whole way as though he might drop it. The men came in from the bunkhouse in ones and twos and stopped in the barn entrance with that particular pause of people encountering something they hadn't fully expected. The tables, the pine boughs, the actual food on actual plates rather than the bunkhouse tin setup they were accustomed to. Virgil, who had been on the ranch 12 years, and whose face Nora had decided contained entire chapters of this place's history, stopped in the entrance and looked at the pine boughs and said nothing at all for a moment. Then he took his hat off and came inside. Caleb was already there, standing at the far end of the table near Elliot, and Nora watched the men read the room. Read him standing there, read the setup, make whatever calculations they needed to make, and then sit down, gradually, in the tentative way of people who aren't sure yet whether they are allowed to relax. She sat across from Clara, midway down the table, and let the food do what food does. It took about 15 minutes. She had learned this in Abilene, had learned it nursing Daniel and managing the neighbors who came to help and needed feeding and arrived tense with someone else's difficulty and left slightly lighter than they came. Food does not solve problems, but it creates a temporary suspension of the conditions under which problems feel unsolvable. And in that suspension, people can sometimes see things they couldn't see before. By the time the cornbread was halfway gone and the beef stew had been refilled twice, the barn had a sound she hadn't heard in the Voss household before. It was the sound of people eating together and not being careful. Conversation that went sideways into laughter before catching itself. The particular music of tin cups and past dishes, and someone telling a story that starts with an animal doing something stupid and ends somewhere that wasn't where it started. Caleb sat at the head of the table and did not talk much, but he listened. She could see him listening, really listening, not managing, not enduring, in the way of a man rediscovering something he'd lost the habit of. At one point, Virgil, who had consumed 2 bowls of stew and appeared to be considering a third, said, "You know what this reminds me of?" And nobody asked him to continue, so he continued anyway. That last harvest dinner before Mrs. Voss got sick. October, 3 years back. She made that cobbler. The table went slightly careful. Nora watched Caleb's hand on his cup. She burned it that year, Caleb said, without looking up from his plate. First time she ever burned a cobbler. She was so annoyed she almost didn't serve it. Virgil nodded. Still tasted good, though. It did, Caleb said. The table breathed again. Elliot was looking at his father from 2 seats down with the focused attention of someone receiving information that is going to matter later. His father had just volunteered a memory of his mother. Casually, in a group, without being asked, and without the flinch that usually followed any contact with that territory. Nora reached for the coffee pot and refilled the cup nearest to her without making anything of the moment. Later, when the cobbler was gone, she had made 3 pans of it, and she'd been right to because there was very little left. And the men were beginning to push back from the tables with the satisfied reluctance of people who don't want to go back to the cold. Virgil appeared at her end of the table. "Ma'am," he said. "Virgil," she said, "that was a good meal." He said it with the directness of someone for whom compliments are practical information rather than social performance. The cobbler especially. "I'm glad," she said. He looked like he was going to say something else and then changed his mind, and then changed it back. "The peaches," he said. She kept 6 jars. Every year she said the peaches were for something special, and then she'd find a reason, and they'd be gone by December. He looked at his hands. "We've had 6 jars sitting in the cold pantry for 3 years. Clara kept putting them up, and I think she was waiting for a reason." Nora looked at him. "Tell Clara the cobbler was good," she said. "She'll be glad to hear it." He nodded, pulled his hat back on, and went out into the cold. The barn took an hour to straighten up afterward, which she did largely alone because Clara had gone to bed, and Elliot had fallen asleep in his chair at the kitchen table, in the attitude of profound exhaustion of a child who has had a better day than usual. Caleb carried him upstairs without waking him, and when he came back down, he found Nora in the barn moving the last of the dishes back into the kitchen, and he picked up the other end of a table without asking, and they folded it to storage together. They worked in silence for a while. "Virgil didn't come to the last harvest dinner," Caleb said. "He and I had a disagreement about the spring calving, and I was harder about it than I needed to be. He came back to work the next day, but he didn't come to the dinner." "Is it settled?" she said. "The disagreement." "It was settled that winter. I was wrong." He lifted one end of a table. "I never said so directly." She took the other end. "You could." "It was 2 years ago." "That doesn't mean it's too late." They moved the table to its position against the wall. He set down his end and stood for a moment with his hands on the wood. "Holt came back," he said. "Thursday. I didn't mention it." She had known he hadn't mentioned it. She had seen the wagon from the kitchen window and watched the same 10-minute conversation in the yard, and watched Caleb stand alone in the yard after Holt left, only this time for longer. "What did he want this time?" she said. "Same thing, different shape." Caleb picked up the canvas covers and began laying them over the stored tables. "He's offering to buy the East Range separately, just that section. Says it would give me working capital through the winter without touching the main operation." He didn't look at her. "It's not unreasonable on the surface." "But," she said, "the East Range has the spring water rights for the South Herd. Sell the land, lose the water rights, and by next summer I'm driving the South Herd 12 miles to water or selling them too." He covered the last table. "After that, the ranch is half what it is now, and at half size it doesn't carry itself through a 3rd bad year." She stood in the middle of the cleared barn and thought. Does the bank know about the water rights? The bank knows what Holt has told them. He finally looked at her. "Holt has a friend at the Harding Creek branch, a man named Farwell. He handles the agricultural accounts." "Is Farwell the only one who makes decisions at that bank?" "No," Caleb said slowly. "There's the branch manager, Archer. But Archer and I have never had much dealing directly. I've always gone through Farwell because Farwell handles ranching loans." "Could you go to Archer directly," she said, "and say what? That Farwell is feeding him bad information on behalf of a man who wants my land?" "Not in those words," she said, "but yes, more or less." He was quiet for a moment. The stove in the corner had burned down to coals and the barn was getting cold, their breath visible in the air between them. "That's a serious accusation," he said. "You'd be stating what you believe to be true to someone who has the authority to verify it," she said. "That's different from an accusation. If I'm wrong, I've made an enemy of the bank and Farwell both. And if you're right, and you do nothing," she said, "Holt gets the East Range and the water rights, and by next July you're making the same decision under worse conditions." He looked at her with the particular expression she had come to recognize as Caleb Voss encountering something he was not prepared to dismiss, but was not ready to agree to, a kind of internal contention, visible at the edges. You've been thinking about this for a while, he said. Since Pete told me about Farwell, she admitted. Pete had no right to... He stopped himself, started again. What else did Pete tell you? That he was worried, she said. That the men who've stayed through 3 bad years have done it for a reason, and they don't want to watch it come undone. She looked at him steadily. That's not disloyalty on Pete's part. That's a man who has a stake in something and doesn't know what to do with the worry. Caleb looked at the covered tables. The Sunday dinners, he said. Is this part of it, what you're doing? She considered being indirect and decided against it. Yes. People who feel like they belong somewhere fight for it differently than people who feel like employees. You have 18 men who have stayed through drought and early freeze and reduced wages, and most of them have never sat at your table. That's not nothing, Caleb. It was the first time she had used his name directly. He looked at her. No, he said after a moment. It's not nothing. The trouble came on a Tuesday, which was the kind of day trouble preferred, ordinary enough that you weren't braced for it. She was in the kitchen garden, which was no longer just fence posts and memory. She had spent 3 days in the previous week turning the soil in the beds that still had any structure to them, not planting. It was November and the ground was nearly frozen. But preparing, clearing the dead matter, working in the compost she'd been building in the corner since the 2nd week. The physical work suited her. She thought better with her hands occupied, and there was a great deal to think about. She heard the wagon before she saw it, and she knew from the sound that it wasn't Holt's. Different horses, faster pace. It was a man she didn't recognize, driving a roan mare too hard for the conditions, who pulled up in the yard and asked for Caleb Voss with the urgency of someone carrying information. Caleb came out of the barn. The man handed him a folded paper. She couldn't hear what was said, but she could see Caleb's face as he read it, and she had learned enough about the geography of that face to know that what she was seeing was not anger. It was something that looked briefly, before he controlled it, like a man looking at something that confirmed the worst thing he'd been telling himself might happen. The man drove away. Caleb stood in the yard holding the paper. Pete appeared from the bunkhouse direction, stopped when he saw Caleb's face, and stopped asking whatever question he'd been about to ask. Caleb folded the paper and put it in his coat pocket and went inside. She gave him 20 minutes. Then she went into the kitchen and found him at the table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him and the folded paper on the table beside it, and she sat down across from him and waited. Farwell called the note, he said. The operating loan. Full amount, 60 days. She understood what that meant. An operating loan called in full with 60 days to pay was not a financial problem. It was a demolition timetable. Can you raise it? She said. Not without selling something. His voice was flat, the flatness of a man who has already run the numbers and does not like them. If I sell the South Herd, which is what Holt will offer to buy, I guarantee it, within the week, I have the money. But I lose the South Herd, and in the spring I'm running at half capacity, and I'll need another loan to build back up, which I will not get from Farwell's bank. What about Archer? She said. He looked at her. If you go to Archer now, she said, before Holt makes his offer, you are showing the bank manager that something in his institution is being used to pressure a landholder into a sale that benefits a man with a relationship inside that institution. That is not a small thing. That is the kind of thing that bank managers do not want exposed. I have no proof, Caleb said. You have the timing, she said. Holt visits. Farwell calls the note. That's not proof in a courthouse, but it's proof enough in a conversation. She kept her voice even. You have 18 men who've stayed through bad years. You have land that's been worked and maintained even through 3 difficult seasons. You have a ranch that functions and has value. What you don't have is someone at that bank who knows what Holt's arrangement with Farwell looks like from the outside. He looked at the paper on the table. If I go to Archer and he sides with Farwell, he said, I've shown my hand with nothing to show for it. Yes, she said, that's the risk. He looked at her. You're not trying to make this easier. No, she said, because it isn't easy, and you'd know I was lying if I said otherwise. He picked up the coffee and drank it cold and set it down. I need to think, he said. I know, she said. She stood. Supper's at 6. She went back to the kitchen garden and picked up the tools she'd left in the soil and kept working, and her hands were cold and the ground was hard, and she thought about 60 days and water rights, and a man named Farwell, who handled agricultural accounts. And she worked until the light was nearly gone, and then she went inside and made supper. Caleb was at the table at 6, and Elliot was beside him. And when she set the food down, Caleb looked up and said, "I'm going to Harding Creek Thursday. I want to speak to Archer before the week is out." She set down the bread. "All right," she said. Elliot looked between them. "Is something wrong?" Caleb looked at his son for a moment. "There's a problem with the ranch finances," he said. "I'm going to deal with it." Elliot absorbed this. "Is it bad?" "It could be," Caleb said, "but I'd rather deal with it directly than wait for it to get worse." Elliot nodded slowly, with the gravity of a boy taking in information that he is being given in a way that treats him as old enough to receive it. "Okay," he said. They ate. And it was not a good meal in the way the Sunday supper had been a good meal. There was too much weight on the table for that. But they ate it together, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the November wind hit the house with the first real edge of the winter coming down from the mountains. And inside, nobody was alone with it. That was something. That was still something. Caleb left for Harding Creek on Thursday before first light. Nora heard him in the kitchen at 4:30. The specific sounds of a man preparing to go somewhere that mattered, more deliberate than his usual morning movement. The particular quiet of someone who has been lying awake for a while and finally decided that lying awake was no longer useful. She stayed in her room and did not go down. He had not asked her to see him off, and she understood that this was something he needed to do in the way that he did most difficult things. Without an audience, without the additional weight of someone else's hope visible on their face. She heard the wagon leave at 5. Elliot came down at 7 and looked at the empty place at the table and said nothing, which meant he had already known, which meant Caleb had told him the night before, which was its own small and significant thing. "He'll be back tonight," she said. "I know," Elliot said. "He said after supper." She put food in front of him, and he ate, and she kept herself busy with the kitchen work that always expanded to fill available time. And she did not let herself think too directly about the bank in Harding Creek and the man named Archer, and whether 60 days could be renegotiated by a rancher with good land and bad luck and no proof of anything except timing. Clara appeared mid-morning, and they worked together on the week's baking without discussing Harding Creek, which was a form of solidarity that Nora had come to appreciate about Clara. The woman understood that some situations were not improved by talking about them. At noon, Pete knocked on the kitchen door and asked if there was anything that needed doing that afternoon, in the tone of a man who had more energy than his regular tasks were absorbing and needed somewhere to put it. "The kitchen garden fence posts," Nora said. 3 of the south ones are loose, if you've got an hour." He did. She watched him from the kitchen window, working on the fence posts with the focused attention of a man doing something manageable when the larger things were not, and she understood that impulse completely. The afternoon went long and gray, clouds moving in off the mountains, the temperature dropping with that particular efficiency that Montana managed in November. Not gradually, but in steps, each hour colder than the last. By 3 o'clock, the light had the flat quality of a sky, considering snow, and by 4 she had added wood to the kitchen fire twice and was starting supper earlier than usual because the cold made people hungry sooner. Elliot came in from outside with his hands red and his coat smelling of pine sap, and sat at the kitchen table and opened his school reader without being asked, which had become his afternoon pattern. She did not know if he was actually reading or using the book as a prop while he thought about other things. She suspected the latter, but said nothing. At 4:30, Clara came in from the back rooms and said quietly, "Wagon on the north track." It was not Caleb's wagon. It was Holt's. Nora dried her hands on her apron and went to the front window. The black-painted wagon with the brass fittings was moving up the track at the same unhurried pace Holt always used, as though he had all the time available in the world and was demonstrating this fact with his horses. Elliot had looked up from his book. "Who is it?" he said. "A man named Holt," she said, "who comes to see your father about business." "Pa's not here," Elliot said. "I know," she said. She went to the front door and opened it before Holt reached the porch steps, which she did deliberately. She had learned from watching him those 2 previous times that he moved best when he was allowed to set the pace and reach the door on his own terms. She wanted him to arrive and find her already there. He pulled up his team and looked at her on the porch, and something moved very briefly in his eyes. Calculation, quick and practiced. "Mrs. He paused. "Miss Whitmore." "Mr. Holt," she said. "Caleb's not here today." I see that. He wrapped the reins around the brake handle and climbed down with the ease of a man who was not going to be discouraged by this information. I can wait. He won't be back until this evening, she said. Late. That's fine. He came toward the porch steps and stopped at the bottom, looking up at her. Perhaps I could wait inside. The weather's coming in. It is, she agreed, and did not move from the doorway. He looked at her with the pleasant, patient expression of a man recalibrating in real time. There's no need for us to be strangers, Miss Whitmore. I've known this ranch and the Voss family for a good many years. I have genuine concern for how things are going here. I'm sure, she said. The situation with the bank, he said, and he said it carefully, measuring each word, is a difficult one. I won't pretend otherwise. But there are options that would protect the men who work here, protect the core operation, and give Caleb a real foundation to rebuild from. I've been trying to help him see that. She looked at him. Mr. Holt, she said, what do you know about the East Range water rights? The pleasant expression held, but something behind it shifted. I beg your pardon? The spring water rights that run with the East Range land, she said. If Caleb sells that section, what happens to the water access for the South Herd? Holt was quiet for a moment. He tilted his head slightly, the way a man does when he is deciding how much to credit a question. That would be a matter for the deed and title documentation, he said. There are ways to structure an arrangement that protects access. Caleb doesn't believe that, she said, and I suspect you know the deed well enough to know why. Another pause, longer this time. Miss Whitmore, he said, and his voice had changed. Not hard, not yet, but the pleasantness had become deliberate in the way that pleasantness becomes when it is being maintained rather than felt. I think this is a conversation better had between myself and Caleb. I agree, she said. So when he's back, I'll tell him you called. Good afternoon, Mr. Holt. She held his gaze for a moment, and he held hers, and she understood in that moment the specific quality of the man she was dealing with, not crude, not violent, not even dishonest in ways that a court would recognize. He was patient, and he was strategic, and he believed that he was ultimately simply better at this than the people across from him. He tipped his hat. Good afternoon, he said. He climbed back into his wagon and turned it at the pace he always used, unhurried, and drove back down the track the way he came. She stood on the porch until the wagon was out of sight, then went back inside. Elliot was in the hallway. He wanted to buy the ranch, Elliot said. It was not a question. Part of it, she said. Pa won't sell, Elliot said, with the certainty of a child who has absorbed something fundamental about their parent without being told directly. No, she said. He won't. Elliot looked at the window where the wagon had been visible. Is he dangerous? Holt? She considered the honest answer. He's the kind of dangerous that wears a reasonable face, she said, which is a particular kind. Your father knows how to handle it. Elliot absorbed this and then went back to the kitchen, and she followed him, and she stoked the fire and went back to the supper that needed finishing, and she did not let herself think about what was happening in a bank office in Harding Creek. Caleb came home at 8:15. She heard the wagon in the yard and heard Pete come out of the bunkhouse to take the horses. And she heard the low exchange of voices that meant Pete was asking and Caleb was answering in short intervals, which was itself information. A man who had nothing to report did not have a conversation in the cold yard at 8 in the evening. He went inside. She put the food on the table. Elliot had waited, which she had not asked him to do. He had simply not gone to bed at his usual time, finding reasons to remain in the kitchen. A drawing he was working on, a question about the school reader that probably could have waited, the particular determination of a child who has decided that waiting is what the situation requires. Caleb came in through the back door, and he looked tired in a specific way. Not the structural exhaustion she'd identified when she first met him, but the acute tiredness of a day that had required a great deal and had given something back, uncertain in what proportion. He looked at the table. He looked at Elliot, who was trying not to look like he'd been waiting. Sit down, Caleb said, not unkindly, and sat down himself. She served the food and sat, and for a moment nobody said anything. Archer listened, Caleb said. She kept her face neutral. Good. He didn't commit to anything, Caleb said. He was careful about that. But he listened to the full account of the timing, Holt's visits, Farwell calling the note, the water rights situation with the East Range. and he did not dismiss it. He picked up his fork. He said he would review Farwell's handling of the account independently. What does that mean practically? She said. It means the 60-day clock may not be the operative timeline, Caleb said. If Archer opens an internal review, Farwell can't push the note forward while it's active without drawing attention to himself. He ate for a moment. It's not a resolution, but it's not nothing. No, she said. It's not nothing. Elliot was following this exchange with focused attention. So we're not selling the East Range? Not today, Caleb said. What about tomorrow? Caleb looked at his son, and something happened in his face. A quick, real response, not managed. Not tomorrow either, he said. We're going to work the problem. Elliot nodded slowly. Holt came today, Nora said, while you were gone. Caleb's fork stopped. Here? He wanted to wait for you inside. I told him you wouldn't be back until late, and he left. Caleb set his fork down. Did he say anything? He mentioned the bank situation, she said, and he talked about options that would protect the men and the core operation. She paused. I asked him about the East Range water rights. Caleb looked at her. You asked him directly. I wanted to see his face when I did, she said. He knew exactly what I was asking. He tried to redirect to deed documentation and arrangements that could protect access, and when I didn't move from the point, he suggested it was a conversation better had with you. Caleb was quiet for a moment. You told him to leave. Politely, she said. He looked at his plate. He picked up his fork again. You had no obligation to do that, he said after a moment. This is where I live, she said. I had every obligation. The kitchen was quiet for a moment, except for the fire. Elliot reached across the table for the bread with the casual ease of a child who has momentarily forgotten to be careful, who has simply decided he is hungry and the bread is there. And Caleb watched him do it, and then looked at Nora, and then looked back at his plate, and she understood that he was working through something that did not have an easy name. Thank you, he said finally. She passed him the bread without ceremony. Eat, she said. You've had a long day. The internal review at the Harding Creek Bank took 11 days, which were 11 of the most operationally ordinary days Nora had spent since arriving in Montana, and 11 of the most internally complex. The ranch ran its regular rhythm. The men worked the cattle through the incoming winter cold, Virgil managing the south herd rotations with the quiet competence of a man who had been doing this long enough to anticipate weather by the way the cattle moved before it arrived. Pete finished the south fence posts and started on the north barn roof, which had a section that had been losing shingles since September. Two of the younger hands, Daniel and a boy named Croft, who was 17 and working his first full season, got into a disagreement over something small that became a disagreement over something less small, and ended with Croft's lip split and Daniel nursing bruised knuckles, which Caleb handled by making them work the same fence section together for 3 days until the irritation ran out of fuel. She watched him handle it and thought about what Clara had said, that he had been different before Margaret died, that he had paid attention. He was paying attention now. She could see it in the difference between how he managed the men in November versus how he had managed them in October. Not dramatically different, nothing so resolved as that, but a shift in the quality of his attention. He asked questions more. He waited longer before deciding. He still went quiet sometimes, in the way Clara had described. The particular withdrawal that was harder on the people around him than anger would have been. But she noticed that after those episodes, he came back into contact sooner, as if the distance were getting shorter each time, as if something that had been measured in days was now measured in hours. Elliot finished the box. He brought it to her on a Friday morning, carrying it with both hands in the manner of someone transporting something fragile that they have invested significantly in. The leather hinges were doubled as she'd suggested, and they held the lid cleanly. He'd sanded the wood to a smoothness she hadn't expected from a 9-year-old with a penknife, and along the front edge of the lid he had burned something with a hot nail. 3 small letters, MV, for Margaret Voss. She looked at it for a long time. It's good work, she said. The hinge still catches a little on the left side, he said. Sand the edge very lightly, she said. Just the left side of the hinge plate. Not much. He nodded, examining the catch himself, his face with that focused quality she'd come to associate with him working through a problem he intended to solve completely. Are you going to give it to your father? She said. He considered the box in his hands. I don't know how, he said. I don't know what to say with it. You might not need to say much, she said. He looked uncertain. What if he... He stopped. What if he gets sad, she said. Elliot's jaw shifted. Yes. He probably will, she said. For a minute. That's not a bad thing. Sad about your mother means he loved her. You can be in the room with that. Elliot looked at the box, at the burned initials on the lid. He ran his thumb over them once. Okay, he said. She did not ask him when he was going to do it. That was his to decide. He did it that evening. She did not witness it directly. It happened in the study, the door mostly closed, and she was in the kitchen and she kept herself in the kitchen deliberately. But she heard it. The sound of the study door, Elliot's light footsteps on the floorboards, and then a silence that lasted about 10 minutes, and then a sound she had not heard from that room before. She could not have said with certainty what it was. A single short sound, controlled. The sound of a man allowing himself something he had been holding back for a very long time in a room where he thought he was private enough to do it. And then Elliot's voice, clear and steady, saying something she couldn't make out through the door. And then Caleb's voice, lower, briefer. And then silence again, but a different silence than the one that had preceded it. Not the silence of a locked room, but the silence of a room where two people were sitting together without needing to speak. She put the kettle on and let it run slow, and when Elliot came out 20 minutes later, his eyes were slightly red, but his face was composed with the dignity of a child who has done something difficult and come through it. He sat at the kitchen table. She put a cup of warm milk in front of him without saying anything about the red eyes. He cried a little, Elliot said. I know, she said. He said the box was the best thing he'd seen in a long time. Elliot wrapped his hands around the cup. He said he was going to put Ma's things in it himself, tonight. She kept her hands busy at the range. He asked me if I wanted to help him, Elliot said. Go through them together. She turned. What did you say? I said yes. He looked at the cup in his hands. We're going to do it Sunday afternoon, after church. He caught himself. After the morning work. Good, she said. He drank the warm milk and went to bed, and she stood in the kitchen alone for a while, and then she sat down at the work table and opened the recipe tin and sat with it in the lamplight, turning the cards over one at a time. Her mother's handwriting. Daniel's mother's handwriting. Her own, from 15 years ago, the letters more uncertain than they were now. The woman on the train to Abilene with the apple cake recipe. Each card a small piece of evidence that she had been in places and learned things and kept going. She was still sitting there when Caleb came to the kitchen doorway. He looked at her with the recipe tin, and then looked at his hands, and then back at her with the expression of a man who has been through something and is still partly in it. He showed me the hinge technique, he said. The doubled leather. He figured most of it out himself, she said. I just suggested the doubling. Caleb leaned against the door frame. He looked older than when she'd first seen him in the wagon in Harding Creek, and she realized after a moment that this was because some of the rigid control had come out of his face, and without it, the actual age of the man was more visible. He was not old, but he had been wearing a particular expression for 4 years that had made him seem less readable than he actually was, and some of that had shifted tonight. I was not kind to you when you arrived, he said. No, she said. I had decided before you came that it wasn't going to work, he said. I had decided that and then gone through with the arrangement anyway, which was not fair to you. Why did you? She said. He looked at the floor for a moment. Elliot, he said. Clara told me he'd stopped eating dinner at the table, that he was taking his meals in his room. I knew it was because of me, because of the way things were. I thought if someone came who was competent and consistent, he might come back to the table. A pause. I didn't think about what it would actually cost the person I brought here to do that. She thought about this honestly. You were trying to help your son. In the most indirect way possible, he said, because I couldn't do it directly, which is not something I'm proud of. She looked at him steadily. You sat down to supper on the first night, she said. You didn't have to do that. You didn't give me much choice. I gave you a choice, she said. You made it. He looked at her for a long moment. Archer sent word today, he said. There's a letter. He's extending a review period on the operating note, which effectively suspends Farwell's call for 90 days pending the account audit. She set down the recipe card she'd been holding. 90 days. It's not a solution, he said, but it's enough time to get through the winter with the herd intact and see what the spring calving looks like. If we have a reasonable spring, the numbers change. He came further into the kitchen and sat down across from her at the work table, which he had never done. Had always stood or sat at the head of the dining table, never here at the work table, which was her territory. Archer also suggested, without being explicit about it, that Farwell's handling of several agricultural accounts over the past 2 years might warrant a broader review. Several accounts, she said. Holt has been busy, Caleb said. We're not the only ranch he's been circling. She absorbed this. The other ranchers, do they know? I don't know what they know, but Archer's review will surface whatever there is to surface. And if there are other families affected, that's not my account to manage. He looked at the recipe tin on the table. It's possible none of this leads anywhere. It's possible Farwell has covered himself well enough and Holt has covered himself well enough, and at the end of 90 days, I'm in the same position with fewer options. Yes, she said. That's possible. You're not going to tell me it'll work out, he said. I don't know if it'll work out, she said. I know the ground is better than it was 3 weeks ago. I know you have 90 days you didn't have yesterday. And I know that in those 90 days, the South herd stays on your land with your water rights, and that matters. He looked at her with something she didn't have a clean name for. Why did you come here, Wassem? He said. Not the arrangement, not the bureau. Why did you actually do this? She had not expected the question, and it took her a moment to find the honest answer rather than the manageable one. I was in a house that had stopped being a house, she said, after Daniel died. It was full of things, and full of memory, and completely empty of anything that would happen next. She looked at the recipe tin. I understood arrangements better than I understood the alternative, which was staying in Abilene and becoming someone who lived inside what used to be. You came here to start over, he said. I came here because I had skills that were useful somewhere, she said, and because I was tired of using them for one person in a room. She looked at him. I did not come here expecting this. This, he said. A household, she said, a real one. I was quiet for a moment, looking at the recipe tin on the table between them. I don't know how to do this well, he said. He seemed to have trouble with the category. I don't know how to be in the room with someone consistently without driving them off. I'm aware that's what I do. You've been in the room with me for almost a month, she said. You don't drive off easily, he said. No, she agreed. I don't. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile exactly, but the preliminary territory of one, the first indication that the muscles involved were capable of it. Clara likes you, he said. She doesn't like people. Clara likes people who do what they say they're going to do, she said. I do what I say I'm going to do. That's not a personal quality, it's just a habit. It's rarer than you think, he said. The second Sunday supper was easier than the first. Not easier to prepare, she had decided to expand the menu, which meant more work, not less. But easier in the way that the second time you do something, you're no longer managing the uncertainty of whether it will work. It would work or it wouldn't, and either way she had cooked a meal for 22 people, and that was a contained and manageable thing. Virgil brought his fiddle. She hadn't known he played. Nobody had told her. He simply appeared in the barn doorway with it under his arm, slightly sheepish in the way of a man who is not sure if the occasion warrants it, and she said, "Good, play something." And his face relaxed immediately into the relief of someone given permission they'd been hoping for. He played through the meal, not loud, not performance, background, the way music was meant to be in a room full of people eating, something your ear followed without your mind having to decide to. Old songs, mostly, the kind that exist below the level of attribution, that everybody knows without being certain where they learned them. Caleb sat at the head of the table. Elliot sat beside him. At one point during the meal, Caleb said something to Elliot that she couldn't hear from her end of the table, and Elliot laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the laugh of a child who has momentarily forgotten the habit of carefulness. And Caleb looked at his son laughing, and something happened in his face that she turned away from because it was too private to witness even from a distance. After the meal, when the men had begun to disperse, and the barn was in the comfortable half-cleared state of an event winding down, Virgil played one more thing, slow, a little mournful in the way that some songs are honest about difficulty without being defeated by it. Clara came to stand beside Nora at the edge of the barn. "This is what it used to be," Clara said quietly. Not exactly, but this. Nora didn't say anything. She would have liked you, Clara said. Margaret, she was practical. She didn't suffer nonsense. Clara paused. She also didn't suffer people who were in pain and pretending they weren't. She would have been at Caleb directly within a week, which he wouldn't have allowed, and it would have been a different kind of fight than the one you've been in. I don't think I've been fighting, Nora said. No, Clara said. That's why it worked. Virgil's fiddle wound down and the last notes went out into the cold air where the barn met the night, and the remaining men drifted toward the bunkhouse with the specific satisfaction of people who have been well-fed and briefly well-accompanied, and Caleb helped carry the tables back to storage without being asked, and Elliot carried dishes back to the kitchen with elaborate care, and Nora stood in the cleared barn for a moment before following them inside. The pine boughs were drying now, the needles going brittle at the edges. Elliot had asked her that morning whether they should put fresh ones down for the second supper, and she had said yes, and he had gone to the north tree line again with the small hatchet and come back with his coat sticky with sap and his face wearing the same expression as the first time, the one trying not to look like pride. They were still on the tables. She picked up one of the small branches and held it for a moment. The smell of it was exactly what Elliot had said, like winter, like the mountains, like something that had been here long before any of them and would be here long after. She set it back on the table and went inside. On the 28th day, Holt came one final time. It was a Tuesday again, which she was beginning to think was simply his preference, and this time he arrived when Caleb was in the yard mending the wagon harness. Visible, unavoidable, a man who could not plausibly be claimed as absent. She watched from the kitchen window. The conversation was longer this time. Holt did more of the talking. At one point he produced a paper from his coat pocket and held it out, and Caleb took it and looked at it and then handed it back. Holt said something further. Caleb said something short. Holt tried one more angle. She could see it in the gesture, the shift in approach. And Caleb shook his head once. Holt stood for a moment with the paper in his hand and then put it back in his pocket with the careful movements of a man absorbing something he had not expected and was deciding how to categorize. He got in his wagon. He drove down the track, and this time there was a difference from the previous departures she had watched. The pace was the same, still unhurried, but the quality of the unhurriedness had changed. Before, it had communicated that he had all the time he needed. Now it communicated something more effortful, a performance of ease rather than the thing itself. Caleb came inside. He had a formal purchase offer, he said. Entire ranch, not just the East Range. She turned from the window. What did you say? I told him the ranch wasn't for sale. He set the harness piece he'd been carrying on the table and sat down. He told me the offer was contingent on the bank situation resolving unfavorably, and that he had faith in the timeline. He looked at his hands. He was threatening me with his own patience. What did you say to that? She said. Caleb looked up. I told him I'd been through 4 Montana winters and 3 bad years and a grief that should have finished me, and I was still here, he said. And that the difference between a patient man and a stubborn one was which side of a fence they were on. She was quiet for a moment. He left after that, Caleb said. Yes, she said. I imagine he did. He looked at the window. He'll be back, he said. Not soon, but eventually. Men like Holt don't abandon a position, they just wait for better weather. Then we'll still be here, she said. He looked at her. We, he said. Not a challenge, not a question, simply the word itself, sitting there, receiving examination. We, she said. The fire in the range settled. Outside, through the kitchen window, Pete was crossing the yard toward the bunkhouse in the gray November afternoon, his collar up against the cold, and the sky above the mountains was the particular shade of white that meant snow before morning, and the house was warm in the way that houses are warm when they are being lived in by people who have decided, collectively, to remain. Caleb stood up. He went to the range and refilled his coffee cup. And then, instead of going to the study or back outside, he pulled out the chair at the work table and sat down across from her the way he had that night with the recipe tin between them. Elliot asked me this morning if you were going to stay, he said. She looked at him. He wanted to know if the arrangement, if it had a... Caleb stopped. He's 9. He doesn't have the vocabulary for what he's asking, but I understood the question. What did you tell him? She said. I told him I didn't know, Caleb said, because it wasn't my question to answer. He wrapped both hands around his cup. It's yours. She looked at the work table. She thought about Abilene, the house that had stopped being a house. She thought about 11 days on a stagecoach with a carpet bag and a tin recipe box and a specific quality of nothing left to lose. She thought about the trunk split in the dirt of the yard and the way she had picked up the tin box first, and how Clara had come across the yard and bent down to pick up a dress and not said anything sympathetic, just told her where the wood was for the kitchen fire. She thought about Elliot's hands on the biscuit cutter and the way he had positioned himself near exits and how that had gradually, over weeks, stopped. She thought about Caleb carrying his bowl to the basin on the first night and sitting down to a meal he had not asked for and had not been able to turn down, and the name Margaret slipping out of him in the kitchen like something he'd been holding too long. I'm not leaving, she said. He looked at her steadily. That's not a small thing to say, he said. No, she agreed. It isn't. Outside, the first flakes of the early winter snow were beginning to come down in the yard, soft and purposeful, covering the ground between the barn and the house with the particular quiet that snow makes, which is not silence but is close enough to it that people who live in snow country often mistake the two. She reached across the work table and picked up the recipe tin and opened it, and she pulled out the apple cake card, the one from the woman on the train to Abilene who had pressed it into her hand at the station and said it would serve her well someday, and set it on the table between them. Sunday, she said, I'll need apples. Do you have any still in the cold storage? He looked at the recipe card. He looked at her. I'll check in the morning, he said. There were apples in the cold storage, 14 of them, wrapped individually in newspaper the way someone meticulous had packed them in autumn, each one still firm, still good. Caleb brought them to the kitchen on Friday morning without ceremony, setting them on the work table in a wooden crate, and she looked at them and counted and said that was enough. He had checked first thing, the way he said he would. She had noticed this about him over the weeks, that he did not make small promises carelessly, and when he made them, he kept them, and that this quality had probably cost him in his life because people who keep small promises tend to feel the weight of larger ones more acutely. It was the same quality that had made his grief so total. You cannot selectively apply that kind of fidelity. The apple cake went on the Sunday table alongside the regular meal, and when she brought it out, Elliot's eyes went to it immediately, with the focused attention he gave to things he wanted but wasn't yet certain he was allowed to want freely. Apple cake, he said. From a recipe a woman gave me on a train, she said. 7 years ago. I've been waiting for the right occasion. He looked at her. This is the occasion? Close enough, she said. Virgil played his fiddle again. The men had begun arriving for Sunday supper with less of the uncertain hovering of the first time. They came in and found their places, and the conversation started sooner, warmer, with the ease of people settling into a pattern that had begun to feel like theirs. Daniel and Croft sat beside each other without visible difficulty, which was its own small resolution. Pete arrived last, as he often did, having spent the extra time on some task he'd assigned himself that nobody had asked for, and took the seat nearest the door with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has decided this is where he belongs. Caleb sat at the head of the table with Elliot beside him, and at one point during the meal he put his hand briefly on the back of Elliot's chair. Not on Elliot, just the chair, just behind him. And Elliot leaned back slightly into the presence of it without appearing to notice he was doing it, the way children lean toward warmth without calculation. Nora saw it from her end of the table and looked down at her plate and kept eating. The bank's formal review concluded in the third week of December. The letter came to Caleb on a Wednesday, and he read it in the study with the door closed, which she respected. And when he came out, his face had the particular quality of a man who has received news that is not everything he hoped for and not what he feared. He found her in the kitchen. Farwell has been suspended pending a full audit of his accounts, he said. 3 other ranching families in the county had similar experiences. Notes called, pressure applied at the same intervals as Holt's visits. Archer has referred the matter to the Territorial Land Office. He sat down. The operating note has been restructured. 36 months, adjusted rate. It's manageable if the spring is decent. And Holt, she said. The land office will investigate his role in the arrangement, Caleb said. Whether that amounts to anything, I don't know. These things take time, and sometimes they come to nothing. He was honest about it, no inflation of the outcome. But his path into the East Range is closed. The water rights are documented in the review record now. Any future offer has to account for what's publicly established. She sat down across from him. The other 3 families, she said. Do you know them? 2 of them. The Harmon outfit south of town and the Bellard widow who runs the small spread on the East Creek. He looked at the table. I should have known about this earlier. Should have been paying more attention to what was happening to the neighbors. You were managing your own difficulty, she said. That's not an excuse, he said. On a frontier like this, what happens to the spread next door happens to you eventually. We're all connected whether we act like it or not. He paused. I'm going to call on them, before Christmas. Let them know what came out of the review, what documentation Archer has. This was new, not the action. Caleb had always been capable of action. But the instinct behind it, the understanding that the boundary of his concern extended past his own fence line. She thought about what she'd said to him in the barn about Holt and what he couldn't offer that Caleb could, about community being harder to dismantle than isolation. And she understood that he had been working on this quietly, in the way he worked on things, without announcing it. I'll send food, she said, with you, for the Bellard widow especially. A woman running a spread alone in December doesn't need a visit that comes empty-handed. He looked at her. Clara can tell you what she might need, she added. He nodded slowly. All right. They sat together in the kitchen for a while after that, not filling the quiet with anything unnecessary, and the fire in the range did what fires do in the winter, which is simply be there, which is sometimes the most useful thing anything can do. Christmas came to the Voss Ranch in the way that Christmas comes to working places, not as a suspension of the regular order, but as a texture laid over it. The work's still there. The cattle still needing water and feed regardless of the calendar, but something additional present in the hours around the work's edges. Elliot made gifts. This was apparently his habit. Clara told her that even in the worst years, even when Caleb had retreated furthest, Elliot had made small things for people, carved or stitched or assembled from materials he found or saved. A carved wooden comb for Clara one year. A repaired lantern for Pete. He did it without fanfare and without expectation of reciprocation, which was the best possible way to give things. He gave Nora the recipe tin back, which was strange because she had never given it to him. It had simply been on the kitchen shelf where she always kept it, but he had done something to it. He had taken it at some point without her noticing and sanded the dented corner where it had hit the ground on the first day in the yard, and worked a small piece of copper sheeting over the damaged area and tapped it flat and smooth. The dent was gone. The corner was reinforced now, stronger than it had been originally, and along the side, in the same technique he'd used on the box for Margaret's things, he had burned a small mark, not her initials, just a single small sprig of pine, 3 needles and a stem. She held it for a long time without saying anything. The corner was weak, he said. It would have cracked through eventually. Thank you, Elliot, she said. He shrugged with the affected unconcern of a boy who has done something he cares about and is protecting himself against the possibility that it wasn't right. The pine was just, I thought it looked good, he said. It does, she said. It looks exactly right. He went back to whatever he'd been doing, and she set the tin on the shelf in the kitchen and stood looking at it for a moment. The pine sprig, the repaired corner, the object made better by having been damaged and then attended to. She thought that was probably true of most things worth keeping. Caleb gave her something on Christmas morning that she had not expected and did not know how to receive immediately. He came to the kitchen early, before Elliot was up, which was unusual enough that she looked at him with a question on her face, and he stood in the kitchen doorway with the expression of a man who has prepared something and is uncertain now that the moment has arrived. He put an envelope on the kitchen table. What is this? What is this? She said. A deed addendum, he said. I had it drawn up in Harding Creek when I went to see Archer. It adds your name to the household property record. He looked at the envelope and nodded at her. Not the ranch, not the land or the cattle, just the house. The building itself and the kitchen garden. She looked at the envelope. Clara witnessed it, he said. It's properly filed. It means that whatever happens with the ranch, whatever the spring looks like, whatever comes next, this house has your name on it, and nobody can change that without your agreement. He paused. I should have thought of it when you arrived. I didn't, which was a failure of basic decency, given what you were walking into. He finally looked at her. You said you weren't leaving. I wanted to make sure you had something that meant it wasn't only your word keeping you here. She looked at the envelope on the table for a long moment. Caleb, she said, it's not, I know it's not a conventional. He stopped. It's the most practical thing anyone has ever given me, she said, including Daniel, who was a practical man. He looked at her. Thank you, she said. He nodded once, with the contained quality of a man who has done something that mattered and is now going to act like it was simply the obvious thing to do. Coffee's not on yet, he said. I was just starting it, she said. He came into the kitchen and they made coffee together, him at the range and her finding the cups, moving around each other in the small space with the ease of people who have learned the geography of each other's movements. And Elliot came downstairs 40 minutes later to find them both at the work table with coffee and a plate of the Christmas biscuits she'd made the night before, talking in the unhurried way of two people who have stopped performing ease and arrived at the actual thing. Elliot stopped in the doorway and took in the scene. Merry Christmas, he said cautiously. Merry Christmas, Caleb said. Come eat something. Elliot came in and sat beside his father without the careful positioning near exits, without the braced neutrality he had worn on the first day like a second coat. He was simply a boy sitting beside his father at a kitchen table on Christmas morning, reaching for a biscuit, present in the uncomplicated way of someone who has stopped waiting for the floor to give way. Spring came late and then all at once, the way Montana springs do, weeks of stubborn cold followed by a week of warmth that hit the ground running and didn't stop. The creek rose. The cattle grew restless with the new grass showing through the remnant snow. Pete found 3 fence lines in worse condition than he'd estimated and came to Caleb with this information directly, without the old habit of approaching sideways, and Caleb looked at the report and said they'd start on the worst section Friday. And what did Pete think about the post spacing on the north run? Pete told him, and Caleb listened, and they made a plan that was Pete's as much as Caleb's, and neither of them remarked on this because it had simply become the way things were done. The spring calving was better than any of the past 3 years. Not remarkable. Not the kind of season that recovers everything in one go, nothing so neat as that, but solid. Enough calves to justify the South herd's winter maintenance. Enough to make the restructured loan look manageable through the summer. Virgil reported the numbers to Caleb on a Tuesday evening, and Caleb sat with them for a day, and then told the men at the Wednesday morning check, and the information moved through the bunkhouse and out into the yard with the specific quality of news that people have been waiting for and are relieved to receive without fanfare. Nora planted the kitchen garden in April. She started seeds on the kitchen windowsill in February, which Elliot monitored with scientific attention, checking the soil moisture with his finger and reporting results daily as though she might not otherwise know. By April, the beds were ready, and she and Elliot put in beans and tomatoes and the herbs she'd been missing since Abilene, thyme and sage, and the flat-leafed parsley that Clara said Margaret had always tried to grow without much success. She grew the parsley successfully. Clara, when she saw it coming up green and full in the bed, said nothing at all for a moment and then said she'd be pleased, and went back inside. And that was the end of it. The Bellard widow, her name was Ruth, and she was tougher and more sardonic than Nora had expected and considerably better at cattle management than the size of her operation suggested, came for Sunday supper in March at Caleb's invitation. She ate with the focused appreciation of someone who has been cooking for one person all winter and has strong feelings about it, and she and Clara developed an immediate rapport based apparently on shared opinions about the inadequacy of people who didn't maintain their own equipment. The Harmon family came in April, all 6 of them, the parents and 4 children ranging from Elliot's age down to a toddler who fell asleep under the table and had to be carried out. The barn was crowded in a way it hadn't been for years, and Virgil played, and one of the Harmon daughters asked Elliot if he wanted to look at the baby animals in the near paddock, and he went with an expression of studied indifference that did not conceal the fact that he was glad to be asked. She watched this from the barn doorway and thought about what it meant to grow up in a household that had opened. In May, Caleb asked her to marry him. He did it in the kitchen garden, which was not a romantic location in any conventional sense. She was on her knees in the dirt working on the bean beds, and he was sitting on the fence at the garden's edge watching her work, which he had taken to doing on weekend afternoons, not helping unless asked, just present in the companionable way he had arrived at gradually and without announcement. He said, "I'd like to make this formal." She sat back on her heels and looked at him. The arrangement already is formal, she said. We have documentation. The house documentation, he said. I mean the rest of it. She looked at him steadily. He was sunburned from the spring work, his hat pushed back, his hands on the fence rail with the ease of a man sitting on his own land in good weather. He looked like a different person than the man in the black wagon on that October street, and he looked exactly the same, and both things were true simultaneously. You're not doing this because the arrangement requires it, she said. No, he said, or because it's practical. It's also practical, he said. I'm not going to pretend it isn't, but no, not because of that. She looked at the bean bed. She thought about the 11 days on the stagecoach and the trunk split in the dirt and the kitchen with the cold chimney and a woman in a doorway picking up a dress and telling her where the wood was. She thought about everything that had accumulated since then. The Sunday suppers and the recipe tin with the pine sprig and Elliot's laugh in the barn and the feel of a house that has decided to be lived in. She thought about what it actually meant to stay somewhere, not as an absence of leaving, but as a real and chosen thing, a commitment that included the difficult parts. The man who went quiet in ways that were harder than anger, the boy still learning how to be a child, the ranch with its uncertain seasons, and its neighbor who would eventually come back with a different face and the same intentions. All of that was true, and she knew it. Yes, she said. He looked at her for a moment. That's straightforward, he said. It's a straightforward question, she said, when you finally got around to asking it. Something moved across his face that she had learned to recognize over the winter. The almost smile, the preliminary territory of it. I've been considering the timing, he said. You've been considering the timing since December, she said. Clara told you, he said. Clara didn't have to tell me, she said. You're not as unreadable as you think. He got down from the fence and came to where she was kneeling in the garden bed and stood looking at her in the dirt with her hands brown from the soil and the bean seedlings around her. And he said, I don't know how to do this perfectly. Nobody does, she said. I've been married before and I did it imperfectly. That's how it works. He put out his hand. She took it, and he pulled her to her feet, and they stood in the kitchen garden that had been fence posts in memory when she arrived and was now growing things. And the mountains were out in the late May afternoon in that full way they had in spring, enormous and close-seeming, the kind of landscape that makes human arrangements feel both very small and very significant at the same time. She did not think that what they had built was a fairy story. She was too old for that, and so was he, and the ranch still had uncertain seasons ahead, and Holt was still somewhere on the eastern range waiting for his moment, and Elliot still had growing up to do in the complicated way that children who have carried loss grow up. None of that was resolved. Some of it probably never would be. But here was what she knew, and she knew it with the specific certainty that comes not from optimism, but from evidence. The house was warm. The table had people at it. The man beside her had learned over one Montana winter to carry his bowl to the basin and sit down to supper and put his hand on the back of his son's chair. And these were not small things. These were the things that actual lives are built from, one ordinary moment at a time, accumulated until they amount to something that can hold against the cold. She had come to Montana with a carpet bag and a tin recipe box, and the knowledge that staying in Abilene was no longer an option. She had not come expecting this. But she had learned, somewhere in the 11 days of travel, or the first morning in a kitchen with a cold chimney, or the moment she watched a 9-year-old boy position himself near an exit, that expecting things was not the same as being ready for them, and that being ready for them was not the same as deserving them, and that sometimes what you find is not what you came looking for, and is better. The recipe tin sat on the kitchen shelf through summer and into the following autumn, its repaired corner gleaming slightly where Elliot's copperwork caught the light. The pine sprig burned into its side, dark and permanent. Nora added cards to it that year. Clara's bean soup method, which Clara had never written down and existed only in the doing until Nora asked her to dictate it one afternoon and wrote it out in her own hand on a new card. Ruth Bellard's sourdough technique, which Ruth had developed over 15 years of feeding ranch hands and was, in Nora's honest opinion, better than her own. A spice cake recipe she worked out herself through 3 failed attempts in October, the failures eaten by Elliot and Pete without complaint, the 4th version getting it right. Elliot found her adding the spice cake card on a Saturday morning and watched her write it and said, "Are you going to keep adding to it forever?" "Probably," she said. "What happens to it eventually?" he said. She looked at the tin, at the pine sprig on the side, at the dented corner that was no longer dented. Eventually it goes to you, she said, when you have a house of your own and people to feed in it. He looked at the tin with the expression of someone receiving information about the future that they are not quite sure how to hold yet. He was 10 now, and growing, and there were days when she could see the person he was going to be standing just behind the person he currently was. Someone steady, someone who paid attention, someone who would do the work of things rather than only talk about them. Okay, he said after a moment. Then, is the spice cake good now, or was it still wrong? It's good now, she said. You can have a piece after noon. He nodded and went about whatever he'd been doing, satisfied, and she set the new card in the tin and closed the lid and put it back on the shelf. Outside the kitchen window, the October light was doing what October light does in Montana, coming in low and golden and temporary, the kind of light that knows it's almost over for the year and is putting in everything it has left. Caleb was in the yard with Pete and Virgil doing something with the wagon that involved tools and specific disagreement about the right approach. The three of them leaning over the same problem in the way of people who have learned to argue about small things without it meaning anything larger. She watched them for a moment. This was not a perfect household. The floors had drafts, and Caleb still went quiet sometimes in ways that took a day to recover from, and the ranch's financial footing was solid but not certain, and winter was coming again with all that entailed. Clara had a cough that had lasted 3 weeks and was making everyone quietly worried. Elliot had started having dreams that woke him, and he did not want to talk about them yet, and she was learning to leave that door open without pushing through it. None of it was resolved. All of it was being lived. That was the thing she had not understood in Abilene, in those months in the house that had stopped being a house, that the alternative to a perfect life was not a broken one. The alternative was an actual one, full of the kind of difficulty that tells you where you are and who you're with, full of the kind of small and unremarkable moments that accumulate, over time, into something that turns out to have been a life after all. She had arrived with a recipe box and left behind a house full of grief she couldn't fix. She had found a different grief and learned to cook in the middle of it, and kept feeding people until the warmth of the kitchen moved out through the walls and changed the temperature of the rooms. That was all she had done. It had been enough. It was, she thought, almost always enough.